Glory Cloud Podcast, episode 171. Well, stay tuned for more of our walk through the Old Testament this week. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Glory Cloud Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cahy, and I'm joined by our co-host, Pastor Todd Bordeaux of Cornerstone Orthodox Presbyterian Church in Houston, Texas. How are you, Todd?
I'm doing well. How you doing?
I'm doing well also. Having a pretty good week.
Good. Are you ready for some common grace?
I am. I never get tired of this topic. I don't know why, but I really like it.
Yeah, for those who are listening, you just did a whole podcast on common grace, so today will be brief, but we'll look at it from a little different perspective. But I'm excited of the different topics as we walk through Genesis, and I'll let you start us off.
Okay, well, I will just briefly run through our regular housekeeping, reminding our listeners that we do have our show notes page over at meredithkline.com/podcast. There you can find all of the resources that we mentioned during the course of an episode. We would sure appreciate it if you would give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and to subscribe to the podcast on whatever you use to listen to it. Both of those things really help to boost our visibility as other people are looking for good theological podcasts to listen to. And finally, if you have the means to pitch in a little bit of money to help us cover the monthly cost of hosting the audio files, you can find a donate button at meredithkline.com/podcast on the right-hand side of the page. And any amount that you can give is very much appreciated, really does encourage Todd and me. And if you don't like the PayPal option behind the donate button, just reach out to us at glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com and we can work something else out. But having run through that, Todd, how would you like to get off the ground with our discussion this week?
Well, just to remind our listeners that what we are doing is we're walking through the Old Testament using Meredith Kline's insights. And for last week, this week, and then mostly next week, for our old-time listeners, it'll be review. We're going to sum up some of the things we talked about in Kingdom Prologue. But after that, it'll be mostly new material as we look at the patriarchs and then the book of Exodus, etc. So I'm very excited about sort of teasing out his view of the Old Testament and how then to understand it and as well as teach and preach it. And so we left off last time in Genesis 3, and so today we're going to start in Genesis 4, and Genesis 4's teaching on common grace. And Kline talked a lot about Genesis 4, both in Kingdom Prologue and in class. So Chris, if you don't mind, why don't you sum up Kline's thoughts, if you can, on Genesis 4?
In terms of common grace?
Yes. Please.
Okay. Well, just briefly, we first encountered common grace in Genesis 3, right after Adam and Eve ate the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil when God confronted them. According to his justice, God should have ended human history right then and there. Adam and Eve should have gone to hell for eternity, and that would have been it. But instead, God gave them a stay of execution, and he gave them gifts that they didn't deserve, gifts that they had forfeited because of their sin. And that's why we use the term grace. But they were gifts that were not eternal in character, and they were gifts that didn't result in eternal life. In fact, we could even say that they were gifts that believers and unbelievers alike received from God. God gave them gifts like the fact that children would continue to be born, there would continue to be marriages. Both of those come from Genesis 3:16. People would continue to plant crops and eat them in Genesis 3:17. So since both believers and unbelievers receive these gifts of God's grace, we call that grace common grace because it is common to believer and unbeliever. But now getting to Genesis chapter 4, we learn more about common grace. In this chapter, Cain kills his brother Abel. So God cursed him in verse 11, and he said, "And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." And that's the end of verse 11. But Cain was afraid that God's curse would mean a horrifying existence in a world of lawlessness. Cain was afraid that the next person he met would kill him to avenge the death of Abel. But God corrected Cain in verse 15, and he says, but the Lord said to him, "Not so. Whoever kills Cain will undergo vengeance sevenfold." Thus the Lord gave an oath to Cain so that anyone who found him would not kill him. And that's the end of verse 15. Most of our modern English versions say that God put a mark on Cain. But this is part of the genius of Kline here, that the Hebrew word ot can also mean oath. And I think it makes more sense out of the text in this context. Kline understands that what God is doing here is instituting human government. So government is also something that believers and unbelievers share in common. Government isn't holy, but it's not unholy either. It's common. The purpose of government is not to usher in the heavenly kingdom of God. The purpose of government, as we see in Genesis 4, is simply to provide a stable environment for human life to continue on. But government isn't the only aspect of common grace that we learn about in Genesis 4. In verses 16 to 24, we read about Cain's family. His children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren went on to do things like build a city, develop the financial world with livestock, develop musical instruments, and to make useful tools out of metal. Now, remember that Cain's family is made up of unbelievers, generally speaking. So unbelievers were the ones developing important cultural artifacts. And what's fascinating is that the Bible doesn't condemn Cain or his family for doing that. That means that culture is good, and believers and unbelievers alike should participate in culture together. So that's really what we learn about common grace from Genesis 4.
And that's Kline's understanding of common, not, as some people think, neutral in a moral way. Kline taught very clearly that unbelievers would abuse government and persecute the church. They would abuse power. But the idea that it's shared and it's a gift for believer and unbeliever to participate in. And so that's what he means by common. And so Joseph and Daniel were not in sin for holding positions in pagan governments.
Right.
Because it was common, it was a gift to the world, even though some would abuse it. And so you see the Lord setting up society in Genesis 4, don't we?
Yeah, lots of cultural advancements right out of the gate there.
So that means there's really no Christian culture, is there?
No. There definitely weren't Christian guitars in Genesis 4.
Right. And not even separate cities
for
right. Christians to live in, right?
Yeah. Sorry to beat a dead horse, but Moscow, Idaho would have been a really strange thing in Genesis 4.
Right. We could go a lot of places as that one. We probably shouldn't. Okay. Well, that leads to the second point, and that is what Kline taught on, the genealogies of Genesis 4 and 5. Genesis 4 ends with Cain's line, and then Genesis 5, of course, begins with Seth's line. And so often I've been asked, especially by young men going into the ministry, how do I preach genealogies? Especially if they have a redemptive historical understanding of the Old Testament. So the question is not only how do I preach genealogies, but how do I preach Christ and the gospel in genealogies, which is the correct question, isn't it?
That's right. I'm really glad to hear that question being asked.
And so the way Kline would answer that is to see these genealogies in light of the history of the promises And so Cain's line, you have the unbelieving line, the non-covenant line. And when you see these names in Genesis 4, Kline taught that each one of these sons listed most likely were royal successors. So Kline suggested in class that we should not assume that this is a sort of a chronological order of every single son of Cain, but these are certain successors, certain kings that actually led lines, sort of like the Tudor line in England or things like that. And so he said it would be illegitimate to try to count the years and then be able to say, well, now we know how old Adam was as far as how old man is if you start with Adam. Because just like there are gaps in the genealogies in the New Testament, that he assumed that there were gaps here also. So you might have 1,000-year gaps or more between names, Kline taught. So it's not right to try to use this in the wrong way. But Kline noted that when you look at Cain's genealogy in chapter 4, things are going from bad to worse, aren't they?
Oh, yeah.
And so what you are to do is to contrast Cain at the beginning with Lamech at the end. And notice he's the seventh one down. And of course, Kline would note that 7 is purposeful. We're at the end of the old world in a sense. We're close to the time of the flood. And Cain is bad enough. Cain seems to shake his fist at God. But then you compare him to Lamech, and Cain seems like an angel.
Right.
Because Cain did not practice polygamy. He had one wife. And yet here Lamech is boasting that he has more than one wife. Lamech boasts of killing a little boy. We should assume Abel was a grown man. And yet here we have Cain is at least asking God for protection.
Mm-hmm.
Lamech is blaspheming God and suggesting he is more powerful than God.
Right.
And so as bad as Cain is in unbelief, as time goes on, the point is things are getting worse, which then raises the question, how is God going to fulfill his promise in Genesis 3 that he would always have a people for himself?
It's true. It's not looking good here at Lamech.
Right. If this is the type of people who are in power, how are God's people going to survive this?
Mm-hmm.
And so then chapter 5 answers that question. You have Seth's line. Seth's line is the covenant line. We see even by the names that the true faith continues because their names are being dedicated to Jehovah. Notice how he dedicated the city, Cain dedicated the city to his son in pride. But many of these names have religious names in the right way. And so somebody taking notes off Meredith in class actually wrote this. It's a great summary of how to understand chapter 5, the genealogy. Here's the point. In spite of the fall, in spite of the escalation of sin, in spite of the apparent triumph of Satan, in spite of his bringing even an antichrist into existence in the world, God's covenant purposes have not failed. God from the beginning has ordained that there should be a people for his name who should be his dwelling place, who at last he would glorify and make into his eternal temple joy and glory. In spite of all that is happening there, God is at work. There is a remnant in the earth. There is a true seed of promise in the earth in the line of Seth. Now that preaches, doesn't it?
Oh, it does, yeah.
And so Kline taught that phrase at the end of chapter 4 about Seth's line, where they began to call on the name of the Lord, is covenant terminology. And so Kline taught that calling on the name of the Lord, another way to see that in the Hebrew is they called themselves by the name of the Lord. In other words, they outwardly identified in the midst of Cain's world, which they lived in, as the people of the Lord. And by the way, I was going to mention that if you don't see gaps in this genealogy, if you take it as straight literal with no gaps, then Adam would have to be alive when Noah was born.
That's true. Yep.
Wouldn't that be odd?
That would be really strange.
And so Kline notes the way this is symbolically laid out in the genealogies is both genealogies end with a man named Lamech. And one is the Antichrist, and one is the opposite. He names his son Noah, meaning rest, longing for the coming rest promised in Genesis 3.
That's really interesting given the first Lamech in Genesis chapter 4, because I was noticing as you were talking about that, it's almost an anti-Sabbath, going down, down, down from Cain to Lamech, and you have almost the opposite of Sabbath there.
Right, so that sevenfold number that Moses picks 7 of the patriarchs throughout history to highlight, ending with a good Lamech versus the evil Lamech.
Right.
And so we understand then that the Sethite community passed on the faith, the oracles of God, and we even see that in the names. The name they gave Noah assumed that they knew all about Genesis 3 and the promise of the gospel of rest. And then, of course, Kline taught a lot about Enoch and Noah, 2 figures in Seth's line who perform a prophetic office. The New Testament reveals this more. Noah's called a preacher of righteousness. And so as we move to these 2, we see 2 men who are called to preach to their generation, to repent or perish, to turn to the true God, the God of Seth. And of course, they prefigure the resurrection as both in their own ways are taking up from this world. Noah in the ark and Enoch taken up, not experiencing death. And so there is a lot of rich gospel teaching in the genealogies. If you understand them redemptive historically, you don't get so caught up in the numbers, the ages, but you see the bigger picture of the whole Bible.
Right.
Any other thoughts on the genealogies?
No, I think you've summarized it really well.
All right, well, let's quickly consider Genesis 6. And again, this is our old listeners. I don't want to say old like you're all old like I am, but you know what I mean.
Yep.
Our longtime listeners. You remember we had a discussion of who are the sons of God that took daughters of men in Genesis 6. There are basically 3 views in the more broader evangelical world, as well as the early church, by the way. This was the view that these are demons who had relations with human women, and their offspring were some mixture of demons and people, and they would then be the giants listed in Genesis 6. The second view is that it's the sons of God, and by the way, sons of God in other parts of the Old Testament do refer to angels, like in Job chapter 1. Others believe those sons of God, going along with what we've already been following, the 2 genealogies, is the line of Seth. Therefore, it's now revealing the great apostasy that has occurred, and it's explaining why there's only Noah and his family who seem to be believers when the line of Seth gave the impression that there is a long line. There should have been many believers.
Right.
And so Genesis 6 then would answer the question, well, the line of Seth in unbelief married unbelieving women and had unbelieving children, so by the time of Noah, there would be none left, hardly any left. Kline he thinks that view obviously is much better than the strange view of demons being able to have sexual relations with women and then producing some weird spawn. But Kline's view was that the sons of God are what they called themselves. In other words, they were the Lamechs that we just read about, the mighty ones, the kings. And so the taking of the women that they thought were beautiful is a literal taking, as in forcefully putting women in their harem, whoever they wanted. These kings were so powerful like Lamech, and that explained why there were no believers hardly left. They were either persecuted or more likely out of pressure in unbelief. They just gave up and they did not persevere, did not prove themselves genuine. And so the sons of God is what kings would call themselves, and others would actually call them. We know from ancient archaeology that the people did write about their kings as gods, as sons of gods, and even up to the Caesars.
Right.
And so as Lamech took on the divine authority to kill who he wanted, it explains both the great apostasy and why things were at the point where God needed to intervene in the flood. And so Kline has a unique contribution to Genesis 6 to provide an interpretation that really flows with where the rest of the Bible has already taken us, with some insights from how people viewed their kings. That's a very short summary, but anything else you want to add to that?
No, I mean, I can't really add anything to it, but I just want to echo what you're saying, that it leads right into this story of the flood, because we've got this situation of just widespread apostasy, so that when Noah comes on the scene, he really seems all alone.
Right, because even one of his sons isn't a believer.
Right.
And so there's literally less, there's a handful of believers left in the ancient world there. Well, that brings us to the flood. Kline has, Billy, he writes a lot on the flood in Kingdom Prologue and in a few other books. We're going to highlight 6 insights that he brought to the flood. And when we say insights, we're not suggesting that Kline is always the first one to ever come up with these. Kline always would admit when he was thankful for other men who have helped him understand things. So it wasn't that, but every once in a while, it's hard to trace back beyond Kline, these insights.
Yeah.
But mostly he would tell us of things he's read, at least in class. But the first one is the covenant with Noah in Genesis 6. Because when God tells Noah to build the ark, it's called a covenant. So Kline wants to do justice to the 2 types of covenants in the Bible. The unilateral covenant of grant, where it's more of a promise, and then the covenant of works types arrangements, where both sides agree to do something to fulfill the covenant. And Kline notes that the covenant here is a covenant grant. It's not you build the ark and then I'll do this. It's simply, I have chosen you to save you from the flood. Now build an ark.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that, Kline notes is that Noah becomes both a second Adam in typology and a type of Christ. Because Noah now becomes, in a sense, the covenant representative. Because the reason God makes a grant with Noah is because Noah is righteous. And so Kline points out that it's not that his family is righteous, but they are saved. So we know at least one son is not righteous. But why is he saved from the flood? Because Noah is righteous. And so Noah's righteousness becomes a type of Christ's righteousness. He becomes a representative for his family in that sense. But the grant itself given to Noah is given to him. God decides to have favor on him. And so he notices the works principle in a typological way with Noah as a representative, that it's Noah's righteousness that allows his family not to undergo judgment. And of course, this only works in typology. Obviously, only Christ can bring us through true judgment. But in the picture, Noah serves as a type of Christ. And so that is Kline's insight into this covenantal language in Genesis 6. Also in Genesis 6, and I'm going to let you talk about this, Kline had a lot of great insights as the ark, as the cosmic house. Why don't you explain what he meant by that?
Yeah. So when Kline would draw his diagram on the board of covenant history, he would make theocracies to be sort of box-like. They would show up on his diagram as boxes. And so Eden was a box, and the covenant with Israel at Sinai was a box, and then he would draw a little one in between those two and say, and that's Noah. And so he saw the ark as, at least inside the ark, as being a theocracy. So there's no common grace inside the ark. There's no distinction between the holy and the common. Everything inside the ark is holy. And so, it's not until after Noah and his family disembark from the ark that we really see the formalizing of the covenant of common grace, because that certainly wasn't the situation that they were experiencing inside during those 40 days and 40 nights.
Yeah, and Kline pointed out that you have a picture of the new heavens and earth living with God because the man and animals are living in peace together.
Right.
And so God must have done something to the animals because they would all, of course, kill Noah and his family
and
eat them and eat each other. And so there's a picture of living in God's eternal house. The ark itself, as you said, is built as a house. So it becomes a Garden of Eden in a sense, and also a looking ahead to the final house. And so the architecture, the way the ark is built is important because it pictures not a boat as you would expect, but a house, right?
Right, with windows and doors and...
Right. And so we have the temple or house of God in a picture. Well, that brings us to the next point in that Kline taught that the flood, and now we're getting to Genesis 7, 8, and 9. The flood is a decreation. What did he mean by that?
Well, Kline saw definite parallels between Genesis 7 and Genesis 1. So I'm just turning to Genesis 7 now, but here God had created the world, and even though human beings derailed God's program, at least from our perspective, they derailed it pretty quickly. There was multiplying and increasing in number among human beings, and so the earth is being populated. But we get to Genesis chapter 7, verse 17. Let's see. The flood continued 40 days on the earth. The water increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the face of the waters. And the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the mountains under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all mankind. Everything on dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those who were with him in the ark, and the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. And Kline sees a relationship between that passage and Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, where the earth is formless and void, and water covered the face of the earth. And so it's sort of back to this state of chaos and disorder. I like that term, decreation. And then we get to the very next verse in Genesis 8:1, but God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark, and God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. And that word there for wind is what we've talked about before in Genesis 1, and where else have we talked about it? Genesis 3, with God storming into his courtroom. It's ruach, which can be translated wind, but it can also be translated spirit. So there's another parallel between Genesis 7 and 8 and Genesis chapter 1, verse 2.
Yes, so the flood, sort of God doing everything back to how it was in chaos, and then bringing a new earth, a new creation. And so, of course, Peter picks up on this, the world that was and the world that's now is. And so really Kline would say from Genesis 1 to Genesis 9, you really have the whole history of redemption, don't you?
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's all crammed into those 9 chapters.
Yeah, you have everything happening that will happen again in 9 chapters, with Noah being the Christ figure, which is interesting because his father named him Rest, thinking he may be the one.
Exactly.
And he was typologically the one for the old world, to point us to the true one, Christ. Well, a couple more, or 3 more insights of Kline. When Noah's ark rested on Mount Ararat, Kline taught that this was a picture of all the mountains we've seen throughout the Bible where God's presence is. And so, given it's a picture of new creation after judgment, it's like a resurrection. Noah coming out of the water. He's on a mountain, just like Armageddon in the end of Revelation. And what does he do? He builds an altar, and he offers an offering of consecration. Very much reminding us that Jesus consecrates the kingdom to his Father at the second coming. And so we have a picture here of resting on a mountain of the new heavens and earth, both in the mountain itself and then consecrating this whole new creation to the Father. So you do have, at that Genesis 9 point, you have the end of the Bible. You have the end of the world in picture. And that's why the next section speaks of common grace. Because now we're going back and we're realizing that this was only a picture. We're going back to a fallen world again. And so we're almost like we're back in Genesis 1 and 2 where God speaks of common grace. And he repeats many of the things, right?
He does. We get some of the same themes.
So anything else? What can you talk about Genesis 9 as far as common grace again? Coming back.
So I really want to mention the very end of 8 before I get right into 9, because we see some of this covenant even there. Chapter 8, verses 20 through 22. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Never will I again strike down every living creature as I have done. And here's the key. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. And so it's as though God is saying that as long as God has appointed the world to continue on, those things will continue to happen. Seasons and times of day and things like that. So we can count on those, but the point is that those things will come to a definite and complete end when God's time is up, when it's time for the end of the world. So we can move on then to chapter 9, verses 11 through 17. God says, I will establish my covenant with you. So they've gotten off the ark now. They're sacrificing to the Lord. God says, I will establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth, and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. And I know we've talked about the figure of the bow when we were going through Kingdom Prologue, but the point I guess I'd like to make here is that this isn't a covenant like God made with Israel or even with Abraham, where it's a very special people that he is entering into a covenant with. This is with all of creation. He's saying, I'm not going to destroy all of creation, and I'm making that solemn promise to all of creation, not just to a special people.
Right, so now that the picture is over, the picture of judgment is a way of saying there won't be a continuous picture either.
Right.
So when it starts to rain, we don't have to worry that,
well, this is it.
This is it. But it's a limited time. Ultimately, God will end this old world.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, when we come to the end of Genesis 9, now that common grace has been established, saving grace is then promised again. And so the oracle at the end of Genesis 9 is really a reestablishing of what's already been seen throughout the rest of Genesis, that God promised in Genesis 3 to always have a covenant people. We saw that through Seth's line. It ended with Noah, of course. And now we pick up with Noah's sons, and we're told right away that Shem will be the covenant line. Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. And Canaan would be a slave of Shem. And that slavery is more a symbolic way of saying will be defeated by Shem. And so now we know that the Israelites, the Jewish people, come from Shem's line, and we will be able to trace that as we continue through. And so the covenant line picks up where it left off. Ham, of course, is the line of Canaan. That's the line that's cursed. So may Canaan be cursed would play itself out in Old Testament salvation history with the destruction of the Canaanites. And some of the sons of Ham end up being some of the other nations like Babylon and Egypt, who are also involved in defeats from the Lord. But the focus there is on Canaan, which would be a picture of all unbelievers at final judgment. But then you have the third son, Japheth, who represents the Gentiles who go off very far and pretty much disappear from the pages of the Old Testament. I say pretty much because every once in a while somebody from the far places will show up, but they're sort of disappearing. They're the people in darkness. And it's said of them, there's a promise in the future, may Japheth live in the tents of Shem. And so now there's a promise that the Gentiles who are far off will be brought near and join the covenant line as God's people in the same house. And so Kline says we have in the first two promises of this oracle Old Testament history, the establishment of Israel and the destructions of the Canaanites. And then you have New Testament prophecy being fulfilled as then the Gentiles are gathered in the new covenant age in the tents of Shem. So again, as you said, all common grace is now laid out for the plan of redemption, and saving grace is prophesied, how it will work itself out in the plan of redemption. All this in the first 9 chapters of Genesis.
It's pretty incredible.
And the amazing thing, we've only summed up a few of Kline's insights into all this.
Yeah, just hitting the highlights.
Right. But that's a good place to stop, and we'll pick up with the Tower of Babel and Abraham next week and look at some of Kline's insights there.
Very good. I'm looking forward to it, and thanks for organizing this. I enjoyed this recap of the early chapters of Genesis.
Thanks for helping me teach it. It's nice.
My pleasure. All right. Well, we would love to hear what you think about this. So please do email us at glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com. You can tweet at us. I am at Machen Guy. Todd is at T Bordeaux. The podcast itself is at glorycloudpod. I'm also on Instagram as at Machen Guy. You can also join the discussion over at the Meredith Kline Facebook group. Just let the admins know that you listen to the podcast and they can get you added. And Todd and I will be back again next week with more of this walk through the Old Testament.